My son actually laughed when he saw me hobble onto his porch with my leg in a heavy plaster cast. He smirked and told his guests that his wife had finally taught me a lesson about independence. He thinks I am just a helpless old woman begging for a holiday meal. He has no idea that the leather bag on my shoulder contains the legal paperwork to evict him within 72 hours. Tonight, nobody is laughing but me. My name is Eleanor Briggs, and at 62 years old, I never imagined I would be standing on my own son's front porch, feeling more like an executioner than a grandmother. The ride service driver had hesitated before pulling away, watching me struggle to plant my aluminum crutches into the icy concrete of the driveway. The snow in Hartfield, Colorado, was unforgiving this year, piling up in thick drifts that seemed determined to swallow my good leg whole. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. The heavy plaster cast on my left leg felt like a concrete anchor dragging me down into the earth. A dull, rhythmic throb pulsed from my fractured metatarsals all the way up to my hip, keeping time with the beat of my own anxious heart. The wind bit through the thin fabric of my old wool coat, seeking out the warmth of my skin with malicious intent. In stark contrast, the house before me glowed with an almost offensive warmth. Golden light spilled from the windows, and the muffled, cheerful sound of jingle bells mocked the biting cold I was enduring out here alone. The front door swung open before I could even lift my hand to knock. My son, Kyle, stood there framed by the hallway light. He was wearing a ridiculous sweater emblazoned with a reindeer, a glass of eggnog already in his hand. When his eyes dropped to my cast and then to the crutches digging into his welcome mat, a laugh escaped his lips. It was not a sound of sympathy. "Well, look who finally made it," he said, his voice loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "How is the leg? Mom Madison told me she taught you a lesson about independence. The cruelty of it stole the breath from my lungs faster than the freezing air." Before I could respond, Madison appeared behind him. She looked flawless in a silk red dress that probably cost more than my monthly heating bill. Her hair was perfect, her makeup immaculate, and her smile was a razor blade dipped in honey. "Oh, Eleanor, you poor thing," she cooed, reaching out not to help me, but to snatch the pecan pie box I was balancing precariously against my crutch. "I will take that. We do not want you dropping it on the nice, clean floor." I forced a tight smile and hobbled inside, swallowing the acidic lump of rage that rose in my throat. I remembered that phrase. My wife taught you a lesson. Kyle had said those exact words to me in the hospital emergency room just days ago, while I lay there waiting for the pain medication to kick in. They had left me there alone to go to a holiday party. That was the moment I stopped being their mother and started being their adversary. The dining room was already full. Kyle had invited an audience, likely to witness his generosity in hosting his invalid mother. Pastor Miller was there, holding a glass of punch. Sitting next to him was Connie, my oldest friend, who looked at me with eyes full of secret knowledge. And then there was the third guest, a quiet man in a grey suit, introduced simply as a friend of the pastor from out of town. Kyle and Madison had no idea that the man sipping their wine was actually Arthur Larkin, one of the most ruthless estate attorneys in the state, and he was currently on my payroll. The room smelled of roasted turkey and expensive pine candles. Kyle and Madison positioned themselves at the head of the table, basking in the compliments of their guests. Meanwhile, Madison gestured vaguely to a corner. "We set up a special spot for you over there." "Mom," she said. "It is a folding chair. So you can have more legroom for that cast. It was a flimsy metal chair, set apart from the main group, with my back turned to the Christmas tree. It was the seat of an outcast, a charity case. I lowered myself into it, wincing as the cold metal bit into my spine. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was sitting here in pain, grateful for the scraps of their attention. I looked around the room, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. The pain in my foot was real, but the fear was gone. I had spent the last 2 months documenting every lie, every stolen dollar, and every forged signature. Tonight was not just a dinner. It was a courtroom, and I was the judge. I rested my hand on my large leather handbag, sitting on the floor next to my good foot. Inside was a stack of bank statements, a digital voice recorder, and a sealed envelope that would shatter their comfortable reality. Watch me take it all back. Daniel? I whispered in my mind to my late husband. Tonight. They learn what a lesson really looks like. 3 months ago, my life was a quiet equation that had already been solved. I lived in the heavy silence of my ranch-style house on the edge of Hartfield. A silence that had settled over the rooms like dust in the 7 years since Daniel passed away. I had my routine. I had my pension from 30 years as a claims processor at Heliomark Insurance Processing. I had a home that we had fully paid off 2 decades ago, and I had a savings account that was modest but sufficient. What I did not have was anyone to share it with. My evenings were a study in solitude. I would heat up a bowl of tomato soup and sit in the blue glow of the television, watching the early snow flurries drift past the window. It was in those quiet moments that the ghosts of Christmases past would visit me. I could almost hear the echo of Daniel laughing as he struggled with the tree stand, or the sound of Kyle's small feet running down the hallway. Kyle had been such a clingy child, a skinny boy who hid behind my skirt and needed me for everything. I used to worry he would never find his own way in the world. Now, he had found his way to the other side of town, and I was lucky if I saw him twice a year. He lived there with his wife, Madison, and my 2 grandchildren, 11-year-old Lily and 8-year-old Noah. They were strangers to me, faces I mostly saw on social media feeds rather than in my living room. I remembered the last time Kyle had actually stepped foot in my house before all of this madness began. He had stopped by only because he needed a signature on some title transfer documents for an old car he was selling. He had not even taken his coat off. He had scribbled his name, given me a one-armed hug while checking his watch, and promised that he would bring the whole family over for dinner when things calmed down. Things never calmed down. Then there was Madison. To see her was to feel instantly inadequate. She worked at a place called Everline Creative Studio, and she carried herself with the polished armor of a woman who never had a hair out of place. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was a sharp, glossy kind of beauty. Whenever we spoke, she was perfectly polite, yet she had a way of looking at my furniture, my clothes, and even my hair, as if they were artifacts from a forgotten civilization. She made me feel small and outdated in my own home without ever saying a rude word. I suppose my greatest sin was my own softness. I was raised on the old belief that if you love your family enough, if you give them everything you have, they will never turn their backs on you. I thought a mother's love was a currency that never lost its value. I was a fool. The silence of my life was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn. The phone rang, cutting through the stillness. When I answered, Kyle's voice was on the other end, thick with unshed tears. "Mum, I need to talk," he had said, his voice cracking. It is serious. That was the moment the ground shifted. That was the phone call that started the long, painful slide from the woman I was then to the woman sitting in a folding chair tonight with a plan for revenge. But back then, I was just a worried mother. I hung up the phone and went to the kitchen to wait for him. My hands were shaking, but habit is a powerful thing. Without even thinking about it, I set the table for dinner. I laid out a plate for Kyle, a plate for myself, and then, as I had done every night for 7 years, I laid out a plate for Daniel, staring at the empty chair and wishing he was there to tell me everything was going to be all right. They arrived on my doorstep on a grey Tuesday evening, looking like refugees from a failed life. Kyle stood amidst a fortress of suitcases, his face pale and his eyes shifting nervously. Beside him, Madison held the hands of Lily and Noah, her usual polished veneer showing cracks of genuine stress. Kyle told me a story about a lost contract, a sudden dry spell in his business, and creditors who were circling like sharks. He asked if they could stay for just a few weeks until they got back on their feet. He looked so much like the little boy who used to scrape his knees in the driveway that I did not hesitate for a second. I opened my door and my arms. For the first few days, I was floating on a cloud of naive happiness. The silence that had haunted the hallways for 7 years was replaced by the thumping of running feet and the sound of cartoons blaring from the television. I made pancakes in the morning and listened to Noah laugh. It felt like the house had a heartbeat again. I told myself that this was a blessing in disguise. Then the changes began. It started with what Madison called helping. She decided that the living room was too dark and cluttered. I came home from the grocery store one afternoon to find that Daniel's old leather recliner, the chair he had sat in for 20 years to watch football, was gone. I found it shoved into the back of the garage, covered in a tarp. In its place sat a sleek, low cream-coloured sofa that looked like it belonged in a dentist's waiting room. Madison smiled at my shock and told me it made the room look so much brighter and that I should not burden myself with heavy, outdated furniture. Slowly, the essence of my husband was scrubbed from the walls. The wooden ship model Daniel had spent 2 years building was moved to a box in the garage because Madison said it was a dust magnet. Our wedding photo on the mantelpiece was replaced by an abstract print she bought online. My collection of commemorative mugs vanished. Every time I looked for something, I was told it had been packed away to keep it safe. Madison soon turned her attention to my paperwork. She told me she wanted to take the load off my shoulders. She gathered my electric bills, my insurance statements, and my bank cards. She suggested we open a joint online account so she could handle the payments for me instantly. Kyle backed her up completely. He put his arm around me and told me to just relax and enjoy my golden years. He said I had spent enough time worrying about money and that I should let them pamper me. It felt like love, but deep in my gut, a small knot of anxiety began to tighten. 2 weeks later, I found a letter in the mail from the bank. It referenced an application for a new home equity line of credit attached to my address. My heart hammered against my ribs. When I showed it to Madison, she did not even blink. She laughed it off, waving her hand dismissively. She told me it was just a system error, a common glitch, and that she would call them to sort it out immediately. She was so calm that I forced myself to believe her. The erosion of my boundaries continued. One day, I found that Daniel's vintage stereo system had been sold. Madison said they needed the space for the kids to store their toys. When I went to the basement to use my sewing machine, I found it buried under boxes of their winter clothes. Madison claimed the needle was dangerous for Noah. I finally snapped and told them to stop moving my things without asking. Kyle turned to me, his face hardening in a way I had never seen before. He told me to stop being so difficult. He said that this was their home too, and that I needed to be flexible. That phrase rang in my ears. Their home. I stood in the center of my living room that evening. The air smelled of expensive vanilla candles that Madison had bought. The walls were bare and grey. The furniture was modern and sharp. It was clean. It was bright. It was stylish. It looked exactly like a high-end rental property listed on a travel website. I realized with a jolt that my home no longer looked like the nest I had built for 40 years. It looked like a staging area for someone else's life. The call that severed the last thread of my denial came at 10 in the morning on a Thursday. It was a verification officer from Pioneer Valley Bank, a local institution where I had banked for 30 years. She wanted to confirm the details of my recent application for a home equity line of credit in the amount of $150,000. I nearly dropped the receiver. I told her I would be there in 20 minutes. I drove to the branch with a cold stone in my stomach. When the loan officer slid the file across the mahogany desk, my hands trembled as I picked up the pages. There, at the bottom of the document, was my signature. It was a terrifying sight because it looked perfect. It had the same slant to the E, the same loop on the B that I had used since high school. But I knew I had not signed it. Above my name, listed as the primary beneficiaries, were Kyle Briggs and Madison Briggs. I was listed merely as a co-signer, the collateral provider. My 30 years at Heliomark Insurance Processing kicked in like a survival instinct. I stopped looking at the signature and started looking at the data. I scanned the contact information. The email address listed was not mine. It was a generic one I had never created. The contact phone number was Madison's cell. Then I looked at the date of the signature, October 12th. I felt a chill run down my spine. October 12th was the day Madison had insisted on taking me to a high-end salon for a makeover, leaving me sitting under a dryer for an hour while she went to run a quick errand. She had not been running an errand. She had been stealing my house. I took the copies home and threw them onto the dining table the moment Kyle walked in. I asked him point blank what he had done. For a moment, the mask slipped. He looked at the papers, then at me, and his face drained of colour. He stammered, looking for words, before landing on a weak defence. He claimed it was a misunderstanding, that Madison had set it up as a smart financial structure to help me save on future estate taxes. He said I must have forgotten signing it during the move. Then Madison entered the room. She did not apologize. Instead, she went on the offensive. She looked at the papers and then burst into tears, crying that she was working herself to death to save this family from financial ruin. She accused me of being ungrateful and suspicious. She told me that I did not understand modern finance and that leverage was how wealth was built. She wrapped her arms around Kyle, sobbing into his chest, effectively turning him into her protector and me into the villain. I backed down. I told them I was just confused, that I was sorry for raising my voice. But inside, the mother who trusted blindly was beginning to die. I went to my room and quietly called the bank officer back on my personal cell phone. I asked if the funds could be frozen while I reviewed the terms. The officer lowered her voice and gave me a piece of advice that made my blood run cold. She told me I needed to get a lawyer because the signature looked forensic, and then she dropped the final bomb. A significant portion of the loan had already been disbursed that morning to a business account under the name Everline Creative Studio. Madison was funneling the equity of my home directly into her own company under the guise of marketing investments. That evening, Madison prepared a dinner that was far too lavish for a Tuesday. She served filet mignon and poured a bottle of red wine that I knew cost over $80. When I asked where it came from, she smiled sweetly and said a grateful client had gifted it to her. I sat there, cutting into the steak, sipping the wine, and realized with a sickening clarity that I was eating and drinking the walls of my own house. I went to bed early, clutching the file of bank papers to my chest like a shield. I could hear them laughing downstairs, the clinking of glasses, the sound of a couple celebrating a victory. I stared at the ceiling in the dark and asked myself a question that terrified me more than the debt itself. If my son and his wife were willing to forge my signature to steal $150,000, what would they do when that money ran out? The morning that changed everything began with a heavy snowfall in the first week of December. The world outside was buried under a pristine white blanket, but inside the house, the atmosphere was suffocating. Madison decided that this was the day we needed to bring the Christmas decorations down from the storage shed in the backyard. When I suggested we hire a neighborhood boy or a moving service to handle the heavy lifting, she looked at me as if I had suggested burning money in the fireplace. She insisted that hiring help was a waste of resources when there were perfectly capable adults in the house. I tried to reason with her. I told her we should wait for Kyle to come home from work so he could carry the large plastic bins. Madison laughed, a dry, humorless sound that made my skin prickle. She told me that I needed to learn to be independent. She said that if I kept acting like an invalid, I would become one. She lectured me on how elderly people who think they are old age much faster than those who stay active. It was a challenge wrapped in a compliment, and like a fool, I took the bait because I did not want to seem useless in my own home. The path to the storage shed required going down the back porch steps. Usually, these were salted heavily during winter, a task I had performed religiously for decades. But today, the wooden planks were covered in a deceptive, glistening sheet of black ice. Madison stood at the top of the stairs, handing me a heavy box of ornaments, her eyes watching me with a strange, detached intensity. She had forgotten to salt the steps, or perhaps she had remembered not to. I took the box, the weight of it pulling at my shoulders. I turned to descend the first step. My boot made contact with the wood, and for a split second, there was friction. Then, there was nothing. My foot shot out from under me with terrifying speed. I did not even have time to scream. I fell backward, the box flying from my hands. The sound of my bone breaking was louder than the crash of the plastic bin. It was a dry, sickening snap that echoed in the cold air. I landed hard on the concrete patio below. A shockwave of nausea rolled through me, followed immediately by a pain so white-hot and piercing that it blurred my vision. The grey winter sky spun violently above me. I lay there gasping, unable to draw a full breath, clutching my leg as the agony radiated from my foot all the way to my teeth. Suddenly, Madison was there. She was screaming, but not for me. She was performing for the neighbors. She wailed about how she had told me to wait, how she had begged me not to carry the heavy box, and how stubborn I was. She knelt beside me in the snow, her hands hovering but not helping, her voice pitched perfectly to sound like a frantic, caring daughter-in-law. I tried to speak, to say that she had pushed the box into my arms, but the pain robbed me of my voice. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and painkillers. At the hospital, the orthopedic surgeon confirmed my fears. I had a severe fracture in my metatarsals and ankle. He told me I would be in a cast for at least 6 weeks. 6 weeks meant I would be immobile for Christmas. It meant I would be completely dependent on Madison for everything from a glass of water to help getting to the bathroom. I lay in the hospital bed, staring at the white plaster encasing my leg, feeling a heavy dread settle in my chest. Kyle did not arrive until after 6 in the evening. He walked into the room, still wearing his work coat, smelling of the cold outdoors. He did not rush to my side. He kissed my forehead briefly, a gesture that felt more like a stamp of approval than a sign of affection, and then immediately turned to comfort Madison. She was sitting in the visitor chair, dabbing at dry eyes, playing the traumatized witness. Kyle looked at me, shaking his head with a smirk that made my stomach turn. He told me that I really needed to learn to listen. He said he hoped I would remember this lesson next time I tried to be a hero. It was a joke to him. My pain was a punchline. Later, when the nurse had left and the room was dim, Kyle leaned over the bed railing. He thought I was asleep, heavily sedated by the medication. He looked at Madison, then back at me, and whispered the words that would fuel my fire for the next 2 months. My wife taught you a lesson, Mum. Now you know who is really in charge of your future. He chuckled, and I heard Madison giggle softly in response. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing even. They thought the drugs had knocked me out. They thought I was broken, both in body and spirit, and they were half right. A bone in my foot was indeed broken. But in that moment, something else inside me snapped, something that could never be put back in a cast. The blind, unconditional love I had for my son died in that hospital room, and in its place, a cold, hard resolve was born. For the first few days after I returned from the hospital, my world shrank to the 4 walls of the downstairs guest bedroom. The doctor had strictly forbidden me from climbing stairs, which meant I was entirely at the mercy of Madison. I, who had raised a child and managed a household for 4 decades, was suddenly reduced to asking permission for a glass of water. Madison controlled my schedule with military precision. She brought me lukewarm soup at noon and my pain medication at exactly 8 in the evening, treating me less like a recovering relative and more like a burdensome pet that needed to be fed just enough to stay alive. It was on the 4th night that the pain in my foot woke me up. It was a sharp, grinding sensation that no amount of ibuprofen could dull. I looked at the digital clock, which read 2 in the morning. The house should have been silent, but it was not. From the kitchen down the hall, the low murmur of voices drifted toward me. The house, which Daniel and I had insulated ourselves, had a quirk where sound travelled through the heating vents with crystal clarity. I carefully manoeuvred my legs over the side of the bed, gritting my teeth against the throb in my ankle. I reached for my crutches. I did not turn on the light. I moved through the shadows, planting the rubber tips of the crutches silently on the carpet until I reached the crack in the door. Kyle and Madison were sitting at the kitchen island. I could not see them, but I could hear every word. "We need to get her to sign the transfer before the snow melts," Madison said. Her voice was not shrill. It was calm, calculated, and terrifyingly businesslike. "If we use the broken leg as leverage, we can get Dr. Evans to certify that she is no longer capable of living independently. It is for her own safety." I held my breath. "And the facility Kyle asked?" I found one outside of Denver. Madison replied, "It is called Holly Creek. It is basic, but it is affordable. Once we move the title of this house to your name for tax purposes, we can leverage the equity to cover the business expansion. The rent from this place will cover her fees at the home with a little left over for us." There was a pause, a silence that I prayed my son would fill with outrage. I prayed he would slam his fist on the table and defend his mother. Instead, I heard Kyle sigh. It was the sound of a man convincing himself that betrayal was actually mercy. "Mum has lived a long life," he said slowly. "We need to start our own life properly. The kids need space more than a slow old woman needs a 3-bedroom house." My grip on the crutches tightened so hard my knuckles turned white. "Exactly," Madison purred. "We just need her to sign the power of attorney forms next week. I will tell her it is just temporary, to handle her bills while she recovers. If she resists, I will remind her that if she falls again without legal protection, the state could take her savings. Fear works wonders on the elderly." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I moved as fast as my broken body would allow, scrambling back into the bed and pulling the quilt up to my chin. The physical pain in my foot had vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow ache in my chest. The realization washed over me in a freezing wave. I was not a person to them. I was an asset to be liquidated. They were discussing the end of my life as if they were planning a garage sale. In the darkness of that room, something fundamental shifted within me. The soft, accommodating mother who believed in forgiveness, the woman I had been for 62 years, quietly died. In her place, a stranger was born. This stranger was cold. This stranger was angry. I closed my eyes and summoned the memory of Daniel. I remembered what he told me just weeks before the cancer took him. He had held my hand and made me promise. "Eleanor," he had said, "you have a good heart, but the world is hard. If the day ever comes when the people inside your house start counting your coins while you are still breathing, you do not stand still. You taught them how to walk. Do not let them walk all over you." I lay there in the dark and made a silent vow. I would not scream. I would not call the police. Not yet. That would be too messy, too emotional. I had 40 years of experience processing complex insurance claims. I knew how to read fine print, and I knew how to document fraud. Kyle and Madison wanted to play a game of finance and law. They thought they were sharks because they knew how to spend money. They had no idea they were swimming with a woman who knew how to audit it. By the time the sun came up, I had stopped crying. I was already planning. The next morning, I put my plan into motion. I told Madison that I needed to go to the clinic for a follow-up X-ray on my foot. She was too busy with a conference call to drive me herself, so she called a ride service, looking relieved to be rid of the burden for an hour. As soon as we were out of sight of the house, I leaned forward and asked the driver to change the destination. I told him my insurance company required me to sign some papers at a different location first. He shrugged and turned the car toward downtown Hartfield, dropping me off in front of a brick building with a brass plaque that read, "Larkin and Howe Legal Group." Inside, I met Olivia Howe. She was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I sat in her office, my crutches leaning against her mahogany desk, and I poured it all out. I told her about the forged loan application, the accident on the unsalted stairs, the missing furniture, and the conversation I had heard through the bedroom door about the nursing home. It felt like vomiting up poison. When I finished, Olivia did not look shocked. She looked determined. She explained the legal terms for what was happening to me: elder financial abuse, forgery, coercive control. She told me that the power of attorney document they wanted me to sign was essentially a warrant for my own financial execution. Her advice was simple and absolute. Do not sign anything, and start gathering evidence immediately, following her instructions. I made a phone call to the bank from the privacy of her office. I requested a temporary freeze on any new transactions regarding my home equity line, citing suspected fraudulent activity. I did not name names yet. I just stopped the flow of money. That evening, I watched Madison tap furiously on her phone in the kitchen, her face flushing a deep, angry red as her debit card likely declined on a business expense. She could not say a word to me without admitting she was spending my equity. So she swallowed her rage, and I ate my soup with a sense of grim satisfaction. Olivia then introduced me to her partner, Arthur Larkin. He was an older man with silver hair and a kind face that I vaguely recognized. He had known Daniel, my husband, from their days playing in a local bowling league 30 years ago. Arthur listened to my case and shook his head in disgust. He told me he would take the case without an upfront fee, collecting only when we won. He looked me dead in the eye and gave me one warning. He said that when the moment comes to drop the hammer, I could not shake. I had to be ready to watch my son fall. My second ally came from closer to home. Connie, my neighbour of 20 years, saw me struggling to get the mail one afternoon and came over to help. I trusted her enough to tell her the truth. Connie, a widow herself who watched too many crime dramas, did not just offer sympathy. She offered technology. She reached into her purse and handed me a digital voice recorder the size of a pack of gum. She showed me how to use it and told me to hide it where they felt most safe. For the next 2 weeks, I became a spy in my own home. I hid the recorder behind the flour jar in the kitchen. I slid it under the sofa cushions in the living room. I caught hours of silence, but I also caught the gold. I recorded Kyle complaining about how stubborn I was. I recorded Madison calculating exactly how much profit they would make after selling my house and paying for the cheap facility at Holly Creek. Every word was a nail in their coffin. Meanwhile, Arthur helped me set up the ultimate shield. During my scheduled appointments for foot therapy, I was actually signing papers to establish an irrevocable trust. I transferred the deed of my house into the trust, naming my grandchildren, Lily and Noah, as the sole beneficiaries upon my death. The terms were strict. The house could not be sold. It could only be lived in by family or rented out, with proceeds going to the trust. I was cutting Kyle and Madison out of the equation entirely. On my final visit to his office, Arthur looked over the stack of evidence and the signed trust documents. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with a mix of respect and sadness. He asked me if I was sure about the timing. He said that if I wanted the knife to go in deep, I should choose a moment when they felt the most secure, a moment when they would essentially push themselves off the cliff. I did not hesitate. I told him I had the perfect date in mind. Christmas. They loved to show off how happy they were on holidays. It would be the perfect stage for their downfall. When I returned home from my secret meetings, I stepped into the greatest role of my life. I became the doddering, grateful old woman that Madison and Kyle so desperately wanted me to be. I sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea, and looked up at Madison with wide, watery eyes. I told her that she was right all along. I told her that the accident was a wake-up call and that I finally understood the lesson she had been trying to teach me. I admitted that I was too frail to manage a house on my own, and that I had been selfish to burden them. The change in their demeanor was immediate and repulsive. They practically vibrated with excitement. I decided to push the charade further. I asked Madison if she knew of any affordable care facilities nearby, pretending to be worried about eating into my savings. I watched a look of greedy relief wash over her face. She and Kyle immediately began pitching the Holly Creek senior residence. They described it as if it were a luxury resort rather than the budget facility 40 miles outside of town that it actually was. They showed me brochures with smiling stock photos and told me I would be so much happier there with people my own age. I nodded along, swallowing my disgust, and agreed that it sounded perfect. Then I set the stage for the final act. I suggested that since I was so incapacitated, perhaps we should host Christmas dinner at their house this year. I told them it would be a symbolic passing of the torch. Kyle agreed instantly. He saw it as the perfect opportunity to announce to the extended family that they had found a permanent solution for his aging mother. He had no idea he was agreeing to host his own trial. During my next checkup with Dr. Evans, I played both sides. I asked him to write a note stating that due to my injury, I required 24/7 supervision for the next few months. This was the document Madison wanted to see. However, I also asked him to conduct a mini mental state examination and write a separate, notarized letter confirming that I was of sound mind and fully capable of making complex legal decisions. He was confused, but he did it. I handed the first note to Madison, and she tucked it into her purse like a winning lottery ticket. The second note went straight to Arthur. A few days before the holiday, Kyle came home with a thick stack of papers. He told me they were just standard forms to help them manage my bills while I recovered. I knew exactly what they were. It was a transfer of deed and a durable power of attorney drafted by some paralegal friend of Madison. I put on my reading glasses and asked endless, foolish questions. I asked if this form was for the cable bill. I asked why there were so many pages just to pay for the water. I played the confused senior so well that Madison eventually snapped. Later that afternoon, my recorder captured the moment perfectly. Madison was in the laundry room talking to Kyle. She told him that they just needed to get me to sign before the turkey was served. She said that once the signature was on paper, the house would be theirs by New Year. She said that I would forget all about it in a week because that is what old people do. Hearing her dismiss my entire intellect was painful, but it was also the final piece of evidence I needed. I called Arthur and Olivia from the bathroom to confirm that the trap was set. The irrevocable trust was active. The freeze on my credit was absolute. The fraud complaint was typed and ready for filing. I told them I had invited a few guests to dinner. I had asked my pastor and Connie to come, and I told Kyle that the pastor was bringing a friend from out of town who had nowhere else to go. Kyle, feeling generous in his impending victory, said the more the merrier. He had no idea that the lonely friend was Arthur Larkin, the man who was about to dismantle his life. That night, I lay in bed, looking at the small ceramic Christmas tree on my dresser. I missed Daniel with an ache that felt like a physical bruise. We should have been drinking cocoa and watching old movies. Instead, I was lying in the dark, clutching a digital recorder and preparing to destroy my son's future to save my own. It was not the Christmas I wanted, but as I closed my eyes, I knew it was the only gift that mattered. I was not a victim anymore. I was the one holding the pen, and tomorrow I would write the ending. We are back in the moment where I first stepped onto the porch, but now the cold outside seems preferable to the suffocating heat of the dining room. I was effectively quarantined in the corner on my metal folding chair. Madison claimed it was to keep my legs safe from the foot traffic, but I knew better. It was to separate me from the conversation, to make me an observer at my own execution. While the others passed around platters of roasted turkey and creamy mashed potatoes, I had to struggle to balance my plate on my lap. Madison was too busy playing the perfect hostess to help me, only pausing occasionally to shout across the room to ask if I had everything I needed. Her voice dripping with a synthetic sweetness that made my teeth ache. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of rich food and expensive wine, but underneath it lay the rotting stench of betrayal. Kyle stood up and tapped his fork against his wineglass, demanding silence. He launched into a speech about how difficult the past year had been and how family was the only thing that mattered. He placed a hand on Madison's shoulder and praised her for the incredible sacrifices she had made to care for his invalid mother. Then, he smiled at the table and announced that they had found a wonderful, long-term solution to ensure I received the professional care I deserved. On cue, Madison grabbed the remote and cast a slideshow onto the large television screen above the fireplace. Images of Holly Creek senior residents flickered by. She described it as a paradise for the golden years, highlighting the communal garden and the bingo nights. She emphasized over and over that I would finally be with friends my own age, as if my current isolation was a choice I had made rather than a prison she had built. I played my part to perfection. I let my chin tremble and wiped a non-existent tear from my cheek. I told the room that my only fear was being a burden to my children. I saw Pastor Miller shift uncomfortably in his seat, and Connie looked down at her plate, unable to stomach the thick layer of hypocrisy coating the room. They sensed something was wrong, but they had no idea how deep the rot went. Once the wine had flowed freely and the dessert plates were cleared, Kyle made his move. He pulled a thick folder from the sideboard and placed it on the tablecloth in front of me. He dismissed the ominous stack of documents as just a few small formalities. Paperwork necessary to ensure everything was legal so they could manage my transition smoothly. He was trying to frame the theft of my life's work as a noble act of administrative housekeeping. I reached out and took the pen he offered. My hand was shaking violently. To them, it looked like the frailty of an old woman terrified of the future. In reality, it was the sheer force of the rage I was barely containing. I touched the tip of the pen to the paper, and the room went deathly silent. Madison leaned forward, her eyes hungry, practically mentally tracing the ink for me. Then, I stopped. I set the pen down on the table with a deliberate click. I looked up and met Kyle's eyes, dropping the mask of the confused widow. "So, just to be clear," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to reach the kitchen. "The deed to my house will be transferred to your name, and I will be shipped off to that budget facility out on the highway. Is that the agreement?" The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The color drained from Kyle's face. Madison, however, panicked. She saw her payday slipping away and abandoned her script. She cut in sharply, her voice losing its polished edge. "We are doing this for you, Eleanor," she snapped. But then, in her haste to shut me up, she said the quiet part out loud. "If we do not do this, what do we have to start our new life with? Do you want us to struggle forever?" The recorder in my pocket caught every syllable. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Connie slowly pushed her chair back. The pastor frowned deeply, looking from me to Madison, and Arthur Larkin, the quiet man in the grey suit who had been eating his pumpkin pie in silence, calmly placed his napkin on the table and reached down for the leather briefcase at his feet. The dinner party was over. The trial was about to begin. I pushed myself up from that flimsy folding chair, my knuckles turning white as I gripped the edge of the table. It took every ounce of strength I possessed to stand on my good leg. But I refused to deliver my verdict sitting down. I demanded silence for 1 minute so I could say my piece. I reached into the pocket of my old festive sweater and pulled out the small black device Connie had given me. I placed it in the center of the table, right next to the cooling turkey, and pressed the play button. The room filled with the tinny but unmistakable sound of Madison's voice from weeks ago. It was the recording from the kitchen. Her voice sneered that she just needed the old hag to sign before Christmas. She said that by the new year, the house would be theirs. She said I would forget in a week, because old people always do. The silence in the dining room was heavy and suffocating. Then came Kyle's voice, clear and damning. He said I had lived long enough. He said he was not going to let his youth rot in my old house. He said the nursing home was the best option. I watched the faces of my grandchildren, Lily and Noah. They looked from the recorder to their parents with wide, horrified eyes, realizing for the first time that the people raising them were monsters. Madison lunged across the table, her fingernails clawing at the tablecloth to snatch the recorder. Before she could touch it, Arthur stood up. He was no longer the quiet guest eating pumpkin pie. He was a shark in a grey suit. He slammed a heavy leather folder onto the table with a sound like a gunshot. He introduced himself as Arthur Larkin, my attorney, and announced that the game was over. He laid out the documents one by one. There was the notification of the irrevocable trust. There were the papers freezing the fraudulent loan. There was the criminal complaint for financial fraud, typed and ready for my signature. I looked at my son and spoke clearly, my voice steady for the first time in months. I explained that I had transferred my house into a trust that no one could touch. I told them that Lily and Noah were the only beneficiaries and that they would not see a dime of it until I was dead. I told them that any attempt to force me to sign a power of attorney would be met with immediate legal action for elder abuse. Pastor Miller looked at Kyle with profound disappointment. He told my son that what he was doing was not just a legal violation, but a sin against God. The shame was too much for the room to hold. Madison turned on Kyle instantly. She shrieked that he had forced her into this plan. She claimed she only wanted to help the family. Kyle screamed back, exposing her debts and her greed, tearing their alliance apart right in front of the children. Arthur cut through the noise with a cold ultimatum. He gave them 2 choices. Option 1 was for Kyle and Madison to vacate my home within 72 hours, sign a binding agreement to repay every cent they had stolen, and never touch my assets again. Option 2 was for me to pick up the pen and sign the criminal complaint, sending the police to their door with the recording as evidence. Kyle slumped in his chair, defeated and humiliated. He agreed to leave. Madison grabbed her coat and stormed out into the snow, leaving her family behind. The dinner was ruined, but my life was saved. Later, as Connie and the pastor helped me clear the plates, my grandchildren hugged me tight, apologizing for things they did not even understand. I sat back in the chair, my foot throbbing, but my spirit felt lighter than air. I had kept my house. I had kept my dignity. I had sent a clear message that no one, not even my own blood, would ever teach me a lesson by trampling on my life again. Thank you so much for listening to my story. And please leave a comment down below telling me where you are tuning in from so we can share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and hit that hype button to help this story reach even more people.